It is time to let the verdict of the people stand. And so I will vote today to acquit the president of these charges. You know, it's been clear for a long time that impeachment is not a priority of the people. It's not even close. It is a pipe dream of politicians. And as the Democrats have forced it on this country over these many months, it has sapped our energy and diverted our attention from the real issues that press upon our country. The issues the people of this nation have tried to get this town to care about for years. I mean the crisis of surging suicides and drug addiction that is driving life expectancy down in my state and across this nation. I mean the crisis at the border where those drugs are pouring across. I mean the crisis of skyrocketing health care costs which burden families, young and old, with bills they cannot pay. I mean the crisis of affordable housing, which robs parents of a safe place to raise their children and build a life. I mean the crisis of trafficking and exploitation, which robs our young girls and boys of a future and our society of their innocence. I mean the crisis of the family farm and the crisis of education costs for those who go to college and the lack of good-paying jobs for those who don't. The crisis of connectivity in our heartland, where too many school children can't access the internet even to do their homework at night. I mean the crisis of unfair trade and lost jobs and broken homes, and I could go on. My point, Madam President, is this. When I listen to the people of my state, I don't hear about impeachment. Now, I hear about the problems of home and neighborhood, of family and community, about the loss of faith in our government, and about the struggle to find hope for the future. And this town owes it to these Americans, the ones who sent us here, finally to listen, finally to act, finally to do something that really matters to them. We must leave this impeachment circus behind us and ensure that our Constitution is never again abused in this way. It is time to turn the page. It is time to turn to a new politics of the people, to a politics of home. It is time to turn to the future. A future where this town finally accepts the people's judgment and the people's verdict, where this town finally delivers for the people who elected him. A future where the middle of our society gets a fair shake and a level playing field. A future where maybe this town will finally listen. When I think of all the energy and all the effort that has been expended on this impeachment crusade over almost 3 years now, I wonder what might have been. Today is a sad day, Madam President, but it does not have to remain that way. Imagine what we might achieve for the good of this nation if we turn our energy and our effort to the work of the American people. Imagine what we could do to keep families in their homes, to bring new possibility to the nation's heartland, to care for our children in every part of this society. Imagine what we could do to lift up the most vulnerable among us who have been exploited and trafficked and give them new hope and new life. Imagine what we can do for those who have been forgotten, from our rural towns to our inner cities. Imagine what we could do to give them control over their own destinies. Mr. President, we can find the common good. We can push the boundaries of the possible. We can rebuild this nation if we will listen to the American people. So let us begin. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in this impeachment proceeding, I worked with other senators to make sure that we had the right to ask for more documents and witnesses, but there was no need for more evidence to prove something that I believed had already been proven and that did not meet the United States Constitution's high bar for an impeachable offense. There was no need for more evidence to prove that the president asked Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. He said this on television on October 3rd, 2019, and he said it during his July 25th, 2019 telephone call with the president of Ukraine. There was no need for more evidence to conclude that the president withheld United States aid, at least in part, to pressure Ukraine to investigate the Bidens. The House managers had proved this with what they called a, quote, mountain of overwhelming evidence. One of the managers said it was proved beyond the shadow of a doubt. There was no need to consider further the frivolous second article of impeachment that would remove from the president and future presidents, remove from this president for asserting his constitutional prerogative to protect confidential conversations with his close advisors. It was inappropriate for the president to ask a foreign leader to investigate his political opponent and to withhold United States aid to encourage this investigation. When elected officials inappropriately interfere with such investigations, it undermines the principle of equal justice under the law. But, Madam President, the Constitution does not give the Senate the power to remove the president from office and ban him from this year's ballot simply for actions that are inappropriate. The question then is not whether the president did it, but whether the United States Senate or the American people should decide what to do about what he did. I believe that the Constitution clearly provides that the people should make that decision in the presidential election that began on Monday in Iowa. The Senate has spent 11 long days considering this mountain of evidence. The arguments of the House managers, the president's lawyers, their answers to senators' questions, and the House record. Even if the House charges were true, they don't meet the Constitution's, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, unquote, standard for impeachable offense. The framers believe that there never, ever should be a partisan impeachment. That is why the Constitution requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate to convict. Not one House Republican voted for these articles. If this shallow, hurried, and wholly partisan impeachment were to succeed, it would rip the country apart, pouring gasoline on the fire of cultural divisions that already exists. It would create a weapon of perpetual impeachment to be used against future presidents whenever the House of Representatives is of a different political party. Our founding documents provide for duly elected presidents who serve, quote, with the consent of the governed, unquote, not at the pleasure of the United States Congress. Let the people decide. A year ago, at the Southeastern Conference basketball tournament, a friend of 40 years sitting in front of me turned to me and said, "I'm very unhappy with you for voting against the president." She was referring to my vote against the president's decision to spend money that Congress hadn't appropriated to build the border wall. I believe then and now that the United States Constitution gives to the Congress the exclusive power to appropriate money. This separation of powers creates checks and balances in our government that preserves our individual liberty by not allowing, in that case, the executive to have too much power. I replied to my friend, look, I was not voting for or against the president. I was voting for the United States Constitution. Well, she wasn't convinced. Now, this past Sunday, walking my dog Rufus in Nashville, I was confronted by a neighbor who said she was angry and crushed by my vote against allowing more witnesses in the impeachment trial. The Senate should remove the president for extortion, she said. I replied to her, I was not voting for or against the president. I was voting for the United States Constitution, which in my view does not give the Senate the power to remove a president from his office and from this year's election ballot simply for actions that are inappropriate. The United States Constitution says a president may be convicted only for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. President Trump's actions regarding Ukraine are a far cry from that. Plus, I said, unlike the Nixon impeachment, when almost all Republicans voted to initiate an impeachment inquiry, not one single Republican voted to initiate this impeachment inquiry against President Trump. The Trump impeachment, I said to her, was a completely partisan action, and the framers of the United States Constitution, especially James Madison, believe we should never, ever have a partisan impeachment. That would undermine the separation of powers by allowing the House of Representatives to immobilize the executive branch as well as the Senate by a perpetual partisan series of impeachments. Well, she was not convinced. When our country was created, there never had been anything quite like it. A democratic republic with a written constitution. Perhaps its greatest innovation was the separation of powers among the presidency, the Supreme Court, and the Congress. The late Justice Scalia said of this checks and balances, quote, "Every tin-horn dictator in the world today, every president for life, has a Bill of Rights. What has made us free is our Constitution." What he meant was, what makes the United States different and protects our individual liberty is the separation of powers and the checks and balances in our Constitution. The goal of our founders was not to have a king as chief executive on the one hand, or not to have a British-style parliament on the other, which could remove our chief executive or prime minister with a majority or no confidence vote. The principal reason our Constitution created a United States Senate is so that one body of Congress can pause and resist the excesses of the executive or popular passions that can run through the House of Representatives like a freight train. The language of the Constitution, of course, is subject to interpretation, but on some things its words are clear. The president cannot spend money that Congress doesn't appropriate, that's clear, and the Senate can't remove a president for anything less than treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors, and 2/3 of us, the senators, must agree on that. That requires a bipartisan consensus. We senators take an oath to base our decisions on the provisions of our Constitution, which is what I have endeavored to do during this impeachment proceeding. Now, Madam President, I ask consent to include a few documents in the record following my remarks. They include an editorial February 3rd from the Wall Street Journal, an editorial from the National Review, also dated February 3rd, an opinion editorial by Robert Doar, president of the American Enterprise Institute, on February 1st, article from the Knoxville News Sentinel yesterday, and a transcript from my appearance on Meet the Press on Sunday, February 2nd, 2020. These documents illuminate and further explain my statement today. Thank you, Madam President.
Without objection. The senator from Nebraska is recognized.
We are not in a quorum call.
That's correct.
I ask unanimous consent to introduce into the Senate record and into the impeachment trial record an op-ed that I wrote in the Omaha World Herald this morning.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Thank you. Mr. President, when the framers wrote the Constitution, they didn't think someone like me would serve as a United States Senator. But they did envision someone like Donald Trump being President of the United States, someone who thinks he is above the law and that rules don't apply to him. So they made sure our democracy had the tool of impeachment to stop that kind of abuse of power. The House managers have clearly laid out a compelling case and evidence of Donald Trump's misconduct. They have shown that the President of the United States of America withheld military aid and a coveted White House meeting for his political gain. He wanted a foreign country to announce, not actually conduct, announce an investigation into his political rivals. And then he refused to comply with congressional investigations into his misconduct. And unfortunately, a majority of United States senators, even those who concede that what Donald Trump did was wrong, are nonetheless going to refuse to hold him accountable. The Senate trial of Donald Trump has been a miscarriage of justice. Donald Trump is going to get away with abusing his position of power for personal gain, abusing his position of power to stop Congress from looking into his misconduct, and falsely claiming he's been exonerated. He's going to escape accountability because a majority of senators have decided to let him. They voted repeatedly to block key evidence like witnesses and documents that could have shed light on the full truth. And we must recognize that still in America, there are two systems of justice, one for the powerful and another for everyone else. So let's speak the truth about what our two systems of justice actually mean in the real world. It means that in our country, too many people walk into courthouses and face systemic bias. Too often, they lack adequate legal representation, whether they are overworked, underpaid, or both. It means that a young man named Emmett Till was falsely accused and then murdered, but his murderer didn't have to spend a day in jail. It means that 4 young black men had their lives taken and turned upside down after being falsely accused of a crime in Groveland, Florida. It means that right now, too many people in America are sitting in jail without having yet been convicted of a crime, but simply because they cannot afford bail. And it means that future presidents of the United States will remember that the United States Senate failed to hold Donald Trump accountable, and they will be emboldened to abuse their power, knowing there will be no consequence. Donald Trump knows all this better than anybody. He may not acknowledge that we have two systems of justice, but he knows the institutions in this country, be it courts or the Senate, are set up to protect powerful people like him. He told us as much when regarding the sexual assault of women. He said, quote, "When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything." He said that Article 2 of the United States Constitution gives him as president the right to do whatever he wants. Trump has shown us through his words and actions that he thinks he is above the law. And when the American people see the president acting as though he is above the law, it understandably leaves them feeling untrustful of our system of justice, distrustful of our democracy. When the United States Senate refuses to hold him accountable, it reinforces that loss of trust in our system. Now, I'm under no illusion that party is poised to hold this president accountable. But despite the conduct of the United States Senate in this impeachment trial, the American people must continue to strive toward the more perfect union that our Constitution promises. And it's going to take all of us in every state, every town, everywhere, to continue fighting for the best of who we are as a country. We each have an important role to play in fighting for those words inscribed on that United States Supreme Court: equal justice under law. Frederick Douglass, who, like many, I consider to be one of the founders of our nation, wrote that, quote, "The whole history of the progress of human liberty, that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle." The impeachment of Donald Trump has been one of those earnest struggles for liberty. In this fight, like so many before it, it has been a fight against tyranny. This struggle has not been an easy one, and it has left too many people across our nation feeling cynical. For too many people, this trial confirms something they've always known, that the real power in this country lies not with them, but with just a few people who advance their own interests at the expense of others' needs. For many, the injustice in this trial is yet another example of the way that our system of justice has worked, or more accurately, failed to work. But here's the thing. Frederick Douglass also told us that, quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." He went on to say, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And he said, "It never did, and it never will." In order to wrestle power away from the few people at the very top who abuse their power, the American people are going to have to fight for the voice of the people and the power of the people. We must go into the darkness to shine a light, and we cannot be deterred, and we cannot be overwhelmed, and we cannot ever give up on our country. We cannot ever give up on the ideals that are the foundation for our system of democracy. We can never give up on the meaning of true justice. And it is part of our history, our past, clearly our present, and our future, that in order to make these values real, in order to make the promise of our country real, we can never take it for granted. There will be moments in time and history where we experience incredible disappointment, but the greatest disappointment of all will be if we give up. We cannot ever give up fighting for who we know we are. And we must always see who we can be, unburdened by who we have been. That is the strength of our nation. So after the Senate votes today, Donald Trump will want the American people to feel cynical. He will want us not to care. He will want us to think that he is all-powerful and we have no power. But we're not going to let him get away with that. We're not going to give him what he wants, because the true power and potential of the United States of America resides not with the president, but with the people, all the people. So in our long struggle for justice, I will do my part by voting to convict this lawless president and remove him from office. And I urge my colleagues to join me on the right side of history. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, considering whether to convict a President of the United States on articles of impeachment is a solemn and consequential duty, and I do not take it lightly. Even before we had a country, our founders put forward the notion of country first, pledging in the Declaration of Independence their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, a pledge they made to an idea, imagining and hoping for a country where no one was above the law, where no one had absolute power. My dad, a World War II veteran, and my mom raised me to understand that this is what made our country the unique and indispensable democracy that it is. My obligation throughout this process has been to listen carefully to the case that the House managers put forward and the defenses asserted by the President's lawyers, and then to carefully consider the constitutional basis for impeachment, the intent of our founders, and the facts. That's what I have done over the past few days. The Senate heard extensive presentations from both sides and answers to the almost 200 questions that senators posed to the House managers and the President's advocates. The facts clearly show that President Trump abused the public's sacred trust by using taxpayer dollars to extort a foreign government into providing misinformation about a feared political opponent. Let me repeat that. The President of the United States used taxpayer money that had been authorized, obligated, and cleared for delivery as critical military aid to Ukraine to try to force that country to interfere in our elections. He violated the law and the public trust, and he put our national security and the lives of Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines of Russian aggression at risk. Although the country was alerted to the possibility that the President had crossed a critical line because of revelations about his now infamous July 25th phone call, it is not the phone call alone that led to the President's impeachment. Instead, the phone call was a pivotal point in a scheme that had started earlier, spearheaded by President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Mr. Giuliani has acknowledged that he was doing the President's personal and political bidding when he engaged with the Ukrainian government. And as the newly elected anti-corruption Ukrainian government came into power, in need of recognition and support from the United States, President Trump forced officials from Ukraine and the United States to negotiate through Mr. Giuliani, conflating his personal and political interests with the national security and diplomatic interests of our country. And then, as President Zelensky resisted the request that he concoct and announce a fake investigation into the Bidens, the President and Mr. Giuliani increased the pressure. Suddenly and without explanation or a legally required notification to Congress, the President ordered that previously approved and critically needed military aid to Ukraine be held up. Mr. Trump, at first through Mr. Giuliani, and then directly solicited interference with an American election from a foreign government. And he ordered others in his administration to work with Mr. Giuliani to ensure this scheme's success. Mr. President, while there is still more evidence that the Senate should have subpoenaed, both witnesses and documents, that would have given us a more complete understanding of what happened, we know as much as we do because of the courage and strength of American patriots who put country before self. Patriots like the intelligence community whistleblower, who was followed by Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and former U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch and William Taylor, as well as current members of the administration. These Americans who came forward were doing exactly what we always ask of citizens. If you see something wrong, you need to speak up. See something, say something. It is a fundamental part of citizenship to alert each other to danger, to act for the greater good, to care about each other and our country without regard to political party. When Americans step forward, sometimes at real risk to themselves, they rightly expect that their government will take the information they provide and act to make them safer, to protect their fundamental rights. That's the understanding between the American people and their representative government. And while the brave women and men who appeared before the House did their jobs, the Senate under this majority has unfortunately not. Rather than gathering full, relevant testimony under oath and with the benefit of cross-examination, the Senate majority has apparently decided that despite what it has heard, it is not interested in learning more. Not interested in learning more about how a president, his personal agent, and members of his administration corrupted our foreign policy and put our nation's security at risk. Not interested in learning more about how they plan to use the power of his office to tilt the scales of the next election to ensure that he stays in power. Not interested in learning more about how they worked to cover it up. Increasingly, over the last few days, the President's defense team and more of my colleagues here in the Senate have acknowledged the facts of the President's scheme. Their argument has shifted from he didn't do it, to he had a right to he won't do it again, or even it doesn't really matter. I disagree so strongly. The idea that in our country, established by the very rejection of a monarchy, the president has absolute power is absurd, as is the idea that this president, whose conduct is ultimately the cause of this entire process, will suddenly stop. President Trump continues to invite foreign powers to interfere with our elections, maintaining to this day that it was, quote, a perfect call. Mr. President, our founders knew that all people, all leaders, are fallible human beings. And they knew that our system of checks and balances could survive some level of human frailty, even in as important an office as the presidency. The one thing that they feared it could not survive was a president who would put self-interest before the interests of the American people, or who didn't understand the difference between the two. As citizen-in-chief and one wielding enormous power, presidents must put country first. So our founders knew that we needed a mechanism to hold presidents accountable for behavior that violated that basic understanding and that would threaten our democracy. And they provided a mechanism for removal outside of the election process because of the immense damage a president could do in the time between elections. Damage in the case of this president's continuing behavior to our national security and election integrity. Our founders believed that they were establishing a country that would be unique in the history of humankind, a country that would be indispensable, built on the rule of law, not the whims of a ruler. Generation after generation of Americans have fought for that vision because of what it has meant to our individual and collective success and to the progress of humankind worldwide. That's the America that I have sworn an oath to protect. I will vote in favor of both articles of impeachment because the president's conduct requires it, Congress's responsibility as a co-equal branch of government requires it, and the very foundation and security of our American idea requires it. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on the day I was sworn in as a United States Senator, I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Just last month, at the beginning of the impeachment trial, I took a second oath to do fair and impartial justice, according to the same Constitution I swore to protect. As I took the oath and throughout the impeachment trial, I couldn't help but think of my father. As many of you know, I lost my dad over the holiday recess. while so many were arguing over whether or not the Speaker of the House should send articles of impeachment to the Senate, I was struggling with watching him slip away, while only occasionally trying to weigh in with my voice to be heard about the need for witnesses in the upcoming impeachment trial. My dad was a great man, a loving husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, who did his best to instill in me the values of right and wrong as I grew up in Fairfield, Alabama. He was also a fierce patriot who loved this country. Although fortunately he was never called on to do so, I firmly believe he would have placed his country even above his family because he knew and understood fully what America and the freedoms and liberties that come with her mean to everyone in this great country and significantly to people around the world. I know he would have put his country before any allegiance to any political party or even to any president. He was on the younger side of that greatest generation who joined the Navy at age 17 to serve our great military. That service and love of country shaped him into the man of principle that he was, instilling in me those same principles. And think of him, his patriotism, his principles, and how he raised me. I am reminded of Robert Kennedy's words that were mentioned in this trial. Few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change. Candidly, to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I fear that moral courage, country before party, is a rare commodity these days. We can write about it and talk about it in speeches and in the media, but it is harder to put into action when political careers may be on the line. Nowhere is the dilemma more difficult than in an impeachment of the President of the United States. Very early on in this process, I implored my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress to stay out of their political and partisan corners. Many did, but so many did not. Even the media continually view this entire process through partisan political eyes and how it may or may not affect an election. That is unfortunate. The country deserves better, and we must find a way to move beyond such partisan divides. The solemn oaths that I have taken have been my guides during what has been a difficult time for the country, my state, and for me personally. I did not run for the Senate hoping to participate in the impeachment trial of a duly elected president, but I cannot and will not shrink from my duty to defend the Constitution and to do impartial justice. In keeping with my oath as senator and my oath to do impartial justice, I resolved that throughout this process I would keep an open mind, to consider the evidence without regard to political affiliation, and to hear all of the evidence before making a final decision on either charge against the president. I believe that my votes later today will reflect that commitment. With the eyes of history upon us, I'm acutely aware of the precedents that this impeachment trial will set for future presidencies and Congresses. Unfortunately, I do not believe that those precedents are good ones. I am particularly concerned that we have now set a precedent that the Senate does not have to go forward with witnesses or review documents, even when those witnesses have firsthand information. And the documents would allow us to test not just the credibility of witnesses, but also test the words of counsel of both parties. It is my firm belief that the American people deserve more. In short, witnesses and documents would provide the Senate and the American people with a more complete picture of the truth. And I believe the American people deserve nothing less. That's not to say, however, that there is not sufficient evidence in which to render a judgment. There is. As a trial lawyer, I once explained this process to a jury as like putting together the pieces of a puzzle. When you open the box and spread all the pieces on the table, it's just an incoherent jumble. But one by one, you hold those pieces up, and you hold them next to each other and see what fits and what doesn't. And even if, as was often the case in my house growing up, you're missing a few pieces, even important ones, you more often than not see the picture. As I've said many times, I believe the American people deserve to see a completed puzzle, a picture with all of the pieces, pieces in the form of documents and witnesses with relevant firsthand information, which would have provided valuable context, corroboration, or contradiction to that which we have heard. But even with missing pieces, our common sense and life's experiences allow us to see the picture as it comes into full view. Throughout the trial, one piece of evidence continued to stand out for me. It was the president's statement that under the Constitution, we have Article 2 and I can do anything I want. That seems to capture this president's belief about the presidency, that he has unbridled power, unchecked by Congress or the judiciary or anyone else. That view, dangerous as it is, explains the president's actions toward Ukraine and Congress. The sum of what we've seen and heard is, unfortunately, a picture of a president who has abused the great power of his office for personal gain. A picture of a president who has placed his personal interest well above the interest of the nation, and in so doing, threatened our national security, the security of our European allies, and the security of Ukraine. The evidence clearly proves that the president used the weight of his office and the weight of the United States government to seek to coerce a foreign government to interfere in our election for his personal political benefit. His actions were more than simply inappropriate. They were an abuse of power. When I was a lawyer for the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission, there was a saying that the chairman of the Inquiry Commission and one of Alabama's great judges used to say, Randall Cole. Judge Cole used to say about judges who strayed from the canons of ethics that the judge left his post. Sadly, President Trump left his post with regard to the withholding of military aid to Ukraine and a White House visit for the new Ukrainian president. And in so doing, he took the great powers of the office of the President of the United States with him. Impeachment is the only check on such presidential wrongdoing. The second article of impeachment, obstruction of Congress, gave me more pause. I've struggled to understand the House's strategy and their failure to fully pursue documents and witnesses, and wished that they had done more. However, after careful consideration of the evidence developed in the hearings, the public disclosures, the legal precedents in the trial, I believe that the president deliberately and unconstitutionally obstructed Congress by refusing to cooperate with the investigation in any way. While I am sensitive to protecting the privileges and immunities afforded to the president and his advisors, I believe it's critical to our constitutional structure that we also protect the authorities of the Congress of the United States. Here, it was clear from the outset that the president had no intention whatsoever of accommodating Congress when he blocked both witnesses and documents from being produced. In addition, he engaged in a course of conduct to threaten potential witnesses and smear the reputations of the civil servants who did come forward and provide testimony. The president's actions demonstrate a belief that he is above the law, that Congress has no power whatsoever in questioning or examining his actions, and that all who do so at their peril. That belief, unprecedented in history of this country, simply must not be permitted to stand. To do otherwise risks guaranteeing that no future whistleblower or witness will ever come forward, and no future president, Republican or Democrat, will be subject to congressional oversight as mandated by the Constitution, even when the president has so clearly abused his office and violated the public trust. Accordingly, I will vote to convict the president on both articles of impeachment. In doing so, I am mindful that in a democracy there is nothing more sacred than the right to vote and respecting the will of the people. But I'm also mindful that when our founders wrote the Constitution, they envisioned a time, or at least a possibility, that our democracy would be more damaged if we failed to impeach and remove a president. Such is the moment in history that we face today. The gravity of this moment, the seriousness of the charges, and the implication for future presidencies and Congresses all contributed to the difficulty with which I've arrived at my decision. I am mindful, Mr. President, that I am standing at a desk that once was used by John F. Kennedy, who famously wrote Profiles in Courage, and there will be so many who will simply look at what I'm doing today and say it is a profile in courage. It is not. It is simply a matter of right and wrong. Doing right is not a courageous act. It is simply following your oath. Mr. President, this has been a divisive time for our country, but I think it has nonetheless been an important constitutional process for us to follow. As this chapter of history draws to a close, one thing is clear to me. As I've said before, our country deserves better than this. They deserve better from the President. They deserve better from the Congress. We must find a way to come together to set aside partisan differences and to focus on what we have in common as Americans. While so much is going on in our favor these days, we still face great challenges, both domestically and internationally. But it remains my firm belief that united we can conquer them and remain the greatest hope for the people around the world. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my full statement be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, today the United States Senate is called upon to uphold our oath of office and our duty to the Constitution because President Trump failed to do that himself. After listening closely to the impeachment managers and the President's defense team, weighing the evidence that was presented to us, and being denied the opportunity to see relevant documents and hear from firsthand witnesses, I will vote to find President Trump guilty on both articles of impeachment. I take no pleasure in voting to impeach a president and remove him from office. I agree with those who say impeachment should be rare and American voters should decide our elections. That is why it's so galling President Trump blatantly solicited foreign interference in our democratic process, and he did it as he geared up for re-election. The evidence shows President Trump deliberately and illicitly sought foreign help to manufacture a scandal that would elevate him by tarnishing a political rival. He attempted to undermine our democracy, using U.S. taxpayer money in the form of U.S. military aid to the Ukraine as leverage for his own personal benefit. The president's aides, who heard President Trump's call seeking a favor from the Ukrainian president, immediately sensed it was wrong. So when they alerted the White House lawyers, the record of the call was immediately placed on a highly classified computer system. And despite the president's claiming that the version of the call that was publicly released is an exact word-for-word transcript of the conversation, we know from testimony that there are key omissions in the document we all read. Compounding the president's misconduct, he then engaged in an extended cover-up that appears to be ongoing to this day. There is a lot to unravel here, and I will provide a more detailed legal explanation in the near future. But for now, let me briefly explain my decision and outline my thoughts on the Senate's impeachment proceedings and the disturbing precedents I fear will be set when the majority chooses to side with the president over the Constitution's checks and balances. The House of Representatives voted to impeach the president for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Based on the uncontested evidence, I concur. It is clear that President Trump and others, such as Mr. Giuliani, who was serving as the president's lawyer, attempted to coerce the newly elected president of the Ukraine to announce 2 sham investigations, including one that sought to directly damage President Trump's rival in the upcoming election. The president's actions served his personal and political needs. not those of our country. His efforts to withdraw military aid and withhold military aid to Ukraine for his own personal benefit undermined our national security. The second article of impeachment charges the president with obstruction of Congress for blocking testimony and refusing to provide documents in response to House subpoenas in the impeachment inquiry. Again, the House managers produced overwhelming evidence of the president's obstruction and his efforts to cover up his malfeasance. The president's counsel offered a number of unpersuasive arguments against this article, which failed to overcome the following. First, that the legislative branch has sole power over impeachment under the Constitution. That couldn't be more clear. Second, past precedents of prior administrations and court rulings. And third, the blatant October 8th letter expressing a complete rejection of the House's impeachment proceedings. The Constitution grants the executive branch significant power, but as every student in America learns, our system is one of checks and balances, so that no branch is entirely unfettered from oversight and the law. President Trump could have us and would have us believe this system of checks and balances is wrong. In President Trump's own words, he expressed the misguided imperial belief in the supremacy of his unchecked power, stating, and I quote, "I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president." Couple this statement with his January 2016 boast that, quote, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose votes." That paints a chilling picture of someone who clearly believes, incorrectly, that he is above the law. The president's attorneys have hewn to this line of faulty reasoning, and in one notably preposterous effort even claimed the president could avoid impeachment for an inappropriate action motivated entirely by his own political and personal interest. The president's defense also failed to sufficiently demonstrate that the president's blanket defiance of subpoenas and document requests overcome the precedents established in prior impeachment proceedings and the record of congressional oversight of the executive branch. In the Clinton impeachment, there was an enormous amount of documentary evidence, as well as sworn depositions and testimony by the president and his closest advisors. In the case of the United States v. Nixon, House Judiciary Committee v. Myers, and others, the House managers rightly point out that the courts have held Congress's power to investigate is as broad as its power to legislate and lies at the heart of Congress's constitutional role. While President Trump's impeachment lawyers claim the House should take the president to court over these previously settled issues, President Trump's lawyers at the Justice Department are simultaneously arguing in the courts that the judicial branch cannot even rule on such matters. As President Trump staked out new, expansive, and aggressive positions about executive privilege, immunity, and the limits of Congress's oversight authority, Republican leaders went along with it. I've heard a variety of explanations for why my Republican colleagues voted against witnesses, but no one has offered the simplest explanation. My Republican colleagues did not want to hear new evidence because they have a hunch it would be really, really bad for this president. It would further expose the depth of his wrongdoing and would make it harder for them to vote to acquit. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle did not ask to be put in this position. President Trump's misconduct forced it upon them. But in the partisan rush to spare President Trump from having his staff and former staff publicly testify against him under oath, a bar has been lowered. A constitutional guardrail has been removed. The Senate has been voluntarily weakened, and our oversight powers severely diminished. This short-term maneuver to shield President Trump from the truth is a severe blow against good government that will do lasting damage to this institution and our democracy. I hope one day the damage can be repaired. The arc of history is indeed long, and it does bend towards justice, but not today. Today, the United States Senate and the American people have been denied access to relevant, available evidence and firsthand witnesses. We've been prohibited from considering new material information that became available after the House's impeachment vote. The Constitution is our national compass, but at this critical moment, clouded by the fog of President Trump's misconduct, the Senate majority has lost its way, no longer guided by the Constitution. In order to regain our moral bearings, stay true to our core values, and navigate a better path forward, we must hold President Trump accountable. The president was wrong to invite foreign interference in our democracy. He was wrong to try and stonewall the investigation. And he is wrong if he tries and he thinks he is above the law. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be lifted.
We're not in a quorum call.
All right.
The senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. From the first words of the Constitution, the weight that lies on every American's shoulders has been clear. We, the people, are the ones who dreamed up this wild experiment that we call America, and we, the people, are the ones charged with ensuring its survival. That's the tension, the push and the pull behind our democracy. Because while there's no greater privilege than living in a country whose Constitution guarantees our rights, there's no greater burden than knowing that our actions could sap that very same Constitution of its power. That our inaction risks allowing it to wither like any other piece of parchment from some bygone era. For the past few weeks, it's been my sworn duty as a United States Senator to sit as an impartial juror in the impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump. And while I wish the president hadn't put our nation in this position, after listening closely, with an open mind, to both sides, it is now my duty as an American to vote on whether to remove him from office. Other than sending our troops into harm's way, I cannot think of a more serious, more somber vote to take in this chamber. But as sobering as it is, the right path forward is clear. Throughout this trial, we've seen unprecedented obstruction from the Trump administration. Obstruction so flagrant it makes Nixon, in the thick of Watergate, look like the motto of transparency. And yet the facts uncovered still prove the truth of the matter. Trump abused his power when he secretly withheld security aid at a White House meeting to try to force Ukraine to announce its investigations into a political rival to help him swing November's election, putting his political self-interest ahead of our national security. He smeared the name of an American ambassador, even seemingly risking her safety because she was simply too principled to further his corruption, because she was too clean to help him strong-arm Ukraine into that favor he demanded. When the reports first emerged about what he'd done, he denied it. Then, his explanation changed to, well, maybe I did do it, but it was only because I was trying to root out corruption. Except that if that were true, there'd be some documentary record to prove that, and we've seen absolutely none, even after I asked for it during the questioning period. And now, his defense team has gone so far as to claim that, well, it doesn't matter if he did do it because he's the president and the president can do anything he wants. It will help him get re-elected. Breathtaking. To put it another way, when he got caught, he lied. Then when that lie was found out, he lied again, then again, then again. And along the way, his own defense counsel could not papier-mâché together even the most basic argument to actually exonerate him. The best case they could muster boiled down to, well, when the president does it, it's not illegal. Nixon already tried that defense. It did not work then, and it does not work now. Because here's the thing, in America, we believe not in rulers, but in the rule of law. And though we've seen over the past few months, the truth has never changed. It's what National Security Council officials and decades-long diplomats testified to under oath. It's what foreign policy experts and Trump administration staffers, and yes, an American warrior with a Purple Heart, have raised their right hands and told us time after time since the House hearings began. Even some of my Republican colleagues have admitted that Trump crossed the line. Some said it as recently as this weekend, but many more said months ago that if Trump did do what he's accused of, then it would indeed be wrong. Well, now it's obvious that those allegations were true. And it's pretty clear Trump's defense team knows that also. Because if they actually believe Trump did nothing wrong, that his call was perfect, then why would they fight so hard to block the witnesses and the documents that could exonerate him from coming to light? The only reason they would have done so is if they knew that he was guilty. And today, the only reason for anyone to vote to acquit Trump is if you're okay with him trying to cover it up. Now, I know that some folks have been saying that we should acquit him, that we should ignore our constitutional duty and leave him in office because we are in an election year, and that the voters should decide his fate. That's an argument that rings hollow, because this trial was about Trump trying to cheat in the next election and rob the voters of their ability to decide. So any action other than voting to remove him would give him the license and the power to keep tampering with that race, to keep trying to turn that election into as much of a sham as an impeachment trial without witnesses. You know, I spent 23 years in the military, and one of the most critical lessons anyone who serves learns is the damage that can be done when troops don't oppose illegal orders, when fealty becomes blind and ignorance becomes intentional. And just as it's the duty of military officers to oppose unlawful orders, it is the responsibility of public servants to hold those in power accountable. Former National Security, former NSC official Fiona Hill understood that, testifying before Congress because she knew that politics must never eclipse national security. Ambassador Bill Taylor understood that as well. The veteran who served in every administration since Reagan's answered the question at the heart of the impeachment inquiry, saying under oath that, yes, there was a clear understanding of a quid pro quo, exactly the sort of abuse of power no president should be allowed to get away with. And Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the Purple Heart recipient who dedicated decades of his life to our armed forces, he understood the lessons of the past too, saying that here in America, right matters. My colleagues in this chamber who have attacked Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who have provided a platform for others to tear him down, just doing what he believes is right, should be ashamed of themselves.